Pokémon Red and Blue have become kind of underrated on the internet. Now, hang on, before you click away, hear me out. I understand that Red and Blue are some of the best-selling and most popular video games of all time. They started what would eventually become the highest-grossing media franchise ever. That's not what you see in online discourse about Red and Blue though, at least. They have a bit of a reputation of being broken, buggy messes created by poor developers that won the game industry lottery. Don't get me wrong, I actually largely agree with the sentiment about the games themselves, at least. I don't think there's much of a reason to play the originals over any other later entry. They're almost comically unbalanced, lots of mechanics just don't work correctly, and they have horrible quality of life features. But I kind of like them still. I think the hindsight perspective on Red and Blue loses a lot of nuance regarding just how impressive the games are for non-technical reasons. It's easy for retrospective naysayers to reduce Red and Blue down to technical games of numbers when in reality, the games are much more than that. Game feel, player immersion, monster attachment, and other elements along those lines rarely get talked about when it comes to Red and Blue anymore. So, what I want to do today is hopefully provide a different perspective on Pokémon Red and Blue. A more nuanced one that evaluates them not just as buggy products or cultural behemoths, but as works of art that manage to resonate with so many people and continue to do so today. Along the way, I'm hoping that we'll reach a better understanding of why the so-called Pokémon formula started by Red and Blue is so successful. Before we get fully started, just a couple of quick things to mention. First, Pokémon Red and Blue are older than I am. I did not grow up with them and I have no nostalgia for them. This is a retrospective take on the games, so I'll have to make a couple of educated guesses as to what living through the Pokémon boom in the 90s was like. Second, we're only going to focus on Red and Blue versions today, not Yellow or the Japanese Red and Green. While I will bring up Yellow at one point, it won't be the main subject for discussion. Finally, this is the part of the video when I normally give a spoiler warning, but if there's a single person watching this video that doesn't know the story of Gen 1 Pokémon and also cares enough to want to experience it blind in 2025, I'd be beyond amazed. Alright, we're now ready to begin. Welcome to Pokémon Red and Blue. Before you start Pokémon Red or Blue, the game has already gotten you personally invested in it, before you put the cartridge in the Game Boy even. The secret is, of course, the alternate versions, the two slightly different copies of the same game that the Pokémon franchise has become known for. I want to spend just a minute or two discussing the common perception of the two-version design choice. I most often see something along the lines of, it's a cool idea, but in practice it's a low-effort cash grab to get some customers to double dip. It's impossible to fully complete the Pokédex without having access to both versions of the game, so you either need to buy one of each version and have access to two Game Boys, or find a friend with the opposite version and trade with them. This emphasis on trading really helped foster the Pokémon community's growth. The franchise slogan and series goal, "Gotta catch 'em all," literally can't be accomplished with just one copy of the game, so kids need to cooperate. That gets them talking more about Pokémon, which might pique the interest of some of their other friends on the playground, thereby expanding the community and also making the existing members more invested. Okay, now that we've established that foundation, let's move on to something else that's not talked about too often with this design choice. It's a very serious question raised by having two slightly different but functionally identical versions of the same game. Which one is better? Red or Blue? Do you weigh them by their exclusive Pokémon? Maybe you really like Oddish, so you pick Red to add it to your team. Well, maybe that's how you decide on the preferred version if you're playing these games in 2025. I'm sure most kids on the playground had no idea of the specific exclusives. I'd wager the decision comes down pretty much entirely to the Pokémon on the cover. Who looks cooler, Charizard or Blastoise? Maybe even that's a bit too generous. Which color is better, red or blue? These are entirely subjective questions that are meaningless in the grand scheme of things, but that's actually what I'm getting at. There is very little at stake here, yet we must make a choice anyway. This immediately splits the player base into two teams of sorts, the red team and the blue team. When you want to play Pokémon, you're forced to pick a side, and that's what I meant by how Pokémon gets you personally invested in the game before you even begin. I don't believe for a second that anyone in the world chooses their preferred Pokémon version randomly. Whether it be the nitty-gritty details on exclusives, the Pokémon on the cover, or just how the name of the game sounds, something makes one version of the game better in your eyes. This then makes the game itself feel, if only ever so slightly, more personal. You saw your options, weighed them against each other, and picked what looked better to you. This is a theme that's going to come up quite a lot. More on that in a bit. Now, you may be thinking, what's the point of all this? Nobody was convinced to like the Pokémon games because they made a personal decision on which version of the game to play. To that, I would answer, absolutely, I agree. This isn't even in the top 20 selling points of the game alone. However, I do think it contributed to the franchise's growth because it allowed the fanbase to engage in humanity's favorite activity, arguing. Kids love arguing with each other. It's just what they do. When you were younger, did you ever debate with your friends over which superhero was the coolest? Or maybe argued over whether Mario or Sonic was better, or anything else along those lines? Trivial debates over personal preferences. I know I certainly did, at least. It's a great way to generate discussion in the player base. Realistically, no one is going to be swayed to change teams since every metric to decide which version of the game is better is subjective. That means these debates never end, which means kids talk about them more, which means Pokémon stays in their minds longer, and so on. While I can't prove how significant this was beyond my anecdotal evidence of experiencing it growing up, albeit with later Pokémon games, but if it could happen to me and my friends, then I'm sure we weren't alone. There's even a little subtle encouragement for this version rivalry in the games themselves. Look at the default names for the player character and the rival, Red and Blue respectively, at least in Red version. While it did eventually become canon that Red was the name of the player character and Blue was the name of the rival, that's not the default ordering in the Blue version of the game. They're swapped, with the first option for the player being Blue and the rival being Red. The rival in the original Pokémon games is infamous for being a bit of a jerk. He's always one step ahead of you, says things like "smell you later," and can pop up unexpectedly to battle you while your team is weakened. If we stick with the default names, then both Red and Blue versions are actually pitting themselves against each other. They want us to view the other team as our rival. Of course, I'm sure most players just filled in their own name for the protagonist and someone they knew or a swear word for the rival. However, I think the default being the names of the games themselves is interesting, at least. Red and Blue aren't typical human person names, so the only reason why I can think they were chosen to be the default was to encourage this divide. Okay, I think it's been enough time to count as a bit, so let's get back to this theme of not too important choices that make the game feel more personal. Thank you for your patience. To show my appreciation, I'll tell you the conclusion of the argument right now. Pokémon is exceptionally good at making the journey feel like your own. What do I mean by that exactly? Well, Pokémon is an RPG, right? A role-playing game. I think we tend to take that aspect of Pokémon for granted since the franchise has basically transcended the confines of video games as a whole. This is a generalization, so of course exceptions exist, but I'd say, for the most part, Japanese-styled RPGs like Pokémon usually have you roleplay as a pre-existing character. Think Cloud from Final Fantasy VII. Even though you can name him, Cloud has his own unique story. On the other hand, there are Western-styled RPGs where you usually create a character to then roleplay as for the duration of the game. Think of the robust character creation and branching paths in Skyrim, for example. Pokémon, though, I don't think fits neatly into either RPG category. In Pokémon, you roleplay as yourself, plain and simple. The player character, who I'll just call Red for the rest of the video, is a completely silent protagonist. He has no spoken dialogue in the entire game. Additionally, he has no real history. The only lore we have is he lives with his mom and is childhood friends with the rival character, Blue. This is about as bare bones as you can get for a video game protagonist, and that's because Red is not meant to be his own character. Red is you, the player, and his journey is, first and foremost, yours. His true lack of character is the first detail that separates Red from other silent protagonists in being a blank slate for the player to project themselves onto. The second critical detail doesn't actually have to do with Red himself, it's the setting of the Pokémon world. It's just like real life. If you ignore the Pokémon for a second, there's nothing special about the world of the game. It's basically present-day Earth, but instead of regular animals, we have Pokémon. Setting an RPG in modern times wasn't invented by Pokémon, but it was super uncommon at the time. I want to emphasize that the Pokémon setting is modern, actually. That's what makes it so easy to become immersed in the world and for a kid to see themselves as Red going on an adventure. Pokémon does not ask us to suspend our disbelief much. All we have to do is accept that Pokémon are the animals of this world, and everything else more or less translates over. Getting the player to accept the game as their own adventure is step 1 for accomplishing Pokémon's goal of getting us to feel like the game is our own story. I know that sounds like the same thing, but it will become clear how they're different later. Now, how does the game reinforce this concept of being your story? It all has to do with choices, the same type of subjective choice as choosing whether to play Red or Blue version. The first, most famous, and most important instance is our choice of starter Pokémon: Bulbasaur, Charmander, or Squirtle. Each of these 3 choices provides a distinct gameplay experience that's obvious as soon as we reach the first gym. Gym Leader Brock uses Rock-type Pokémon, which take less damage from nearly every attack reasonably available to the player at this point in the game. There's only a handful of options to deal normal or super effective damage. 2 of them come from Bulbasaur and Squirtle at later levels. Charmander, however, doesn't learn any of them. The difficulty of Brock is entirely determined by your starter choice. If you picked Bulbasaur or Squirtle and leveled them up, then Brock is ridiculously easy. You probably defeat both of his Pokémon in one hit. If you picked Charmander, you're in for a long and tedious battle of attrition. After Brock, the options to add to your team open up immensely, and there's never really a fight this polarizing ever again. Brock is probably the single most difficult fight in the entire game if you pick Charmander. If that's the case, though, that raises a question. Aren't Bulbasaur and Squirtle just objectively better to pick than Charmander then? This is pretty reasonable, and I think I would agree if the starter Pokémon weren't, well, Pokémon. Let's imagine for a second that instead of choosing between Bulbasaur, Charmander, and Squirtle, we had to choose a starting RPG class for our character between Warrior, Thief, and Mage. Let's then say that Warrior and Mage have an easy time with the first boss battle, but Thief struggles. It's the same situation present with Brock, but at least for me, I think this framing would make picking Thief, or Charmander, feel way worse than it actually does in Red and Blue. That's because our starter Pokémon isn't a thing. Pokémon aren't classes for our character, nor are they weapons to equip. They're our friends, our allies, our pets even. Pokémon are something we can get emotionally attached to in a way that's different from normal RPG class distinctions. I actually believe Brock is an amazing first boss specifically to foster the player's attachment to their starter, regardless of which one they picked. First, I'm going to make an assumption. Kids who played Red and Blue probably heavily relied on their starter for most of the game. I know I did for my first Pokémon game, at least. I basically used my starter for the entire game and funneled all the experience into it. With that in mind, kids most likely used their starter to fight Brock. If they picked Squirtle or Bulbasaur, they're going to see them wipe the floor with him. Since gym leaders are the bosses of the game and are expected to be tough challenges, seeing just how effortlessly their starter can beat him is going to make kids like their starter more. Bulbasaur and Squirtle appear super strong. On the other hand, Charmander struggles, but so does everything else at this point in the game. Unless kids know specifically to catch a Caterpie and evolve it to a Butterfree that learns Confusion, every attack accessible to them is resisted by Brock's Pokémon. This ensures that Charmander doesn't come across as weak to the player. If everything else is struggling and Charmander is probably their highest leveled Pokémon, then Charmander is still going to look relatively strong compared to everything else. The fight with Brock then becomes a nail-biter where the difference maker will probably be Charmander. It's a different type of experience, but it communicates the same feeling of putting the player's starter on a pedestal. That's why the starter Pokemon choice doesn't actually matter that much. The emotional experience is the most important part since the rest of the game is so trivial. Bulbasaur and Squirtle show off how powerful they are right away, while Charmander endures a close fight and the player becomes excited for it to pull off a clutch victory. This emotion only can work if the starter Pokemon are Pokemon. It gives us a sense of pride that our little friend was able to overcome what seemed like an insurmountable obstacle. After Brock, we're probably feeling pretty good about ourselves and our starter choice. That adds so much fuel to the next never-ending debate. Which starter is the best one? It's the same exact thing as the version argument. It's just a matter of personal preference, but Brock is designed in such a way to get kids to really double down on their choice. This takes the already split player base and splits each half into 3 more factions each. Each of these groups of players is going to have a slightly different experience from each other, which again, makes the game feel more personalized. It's crazy how much variance there already is in the games when we haven't even talked about the endless team composition possibilities. Actually, you know what? We don't even have to do that. Let's quickly highlight all the other subjective choices the player is forced to make throughout the game. In Mount Moon, we have to pick between the Dome Fossil or the Helix Fossil, and we can't get the other on the same playthrough. Each copy of the game only gets access to one Eevee, so if we want to evolve it, we have to make a choice between Jolteon, Flareon, or Vaporeon. Once we clear the fighting dojo, we have to pick between Hitmonchan and Hitmonlee, with no opportunity to get the one we missed. Oh, and also technically, once we reach Celadon City, we are no longer bound by the gym ordering and can go about finishing the game in many different ways. The only gym badges you actually need to reach Celadon are Brock's and Misty's. You can fight the gym leader's Lieutenant Surge through Blaine in any order you want, as long as you fight Koga before Blaine. Speaking of Koga, his gym is in Fuchsia City, and I think the journey to Fuchsia is emblematic of Pokemon Red and Blue's design philosophy. We can get to the city in 2 different ways. We can go through Cycling Road from Celadon's west, or we can head south of Lavender Town through routes 13, 14, and 15. Both ways are blocked by sleeping Snorlaxes that we've likely stumbled across earlier in the adventure. Cycling Road is a fast-paced route filled with bikers using poison and fighting-type Pokemon, while the other routes have a mix of a bunch of different trainer types using a variety of Pokemon. Both paths lead to Fuchsia City, but they provide very different experiences. Cycling Road is very quick and breezy. It requires us to pick up the bike earlier, but we probably want to do that anyway to make traversal faster. On the other hand, the route 13 through 15 Gauntlet is one of the longest stretches of land between towns in the entire game. I guess you could call it the scenic route. When I think of the 2 paths to Fuchsia in relation to each other, I can't help but be reminded of the starter choice and how it affects the Brock fight. Charmander is the scenic route, while Bulbasaur and Squirtle take the fast track. They ultimately lead to the same place, but the way of getting there is very different. While one way may technically be quicker, it really doesn't matter because in the end, the outcome is the same. That is Pokemon's entire design philosophy, and what separates the adventure from the story. Every player goes on the same basic adventure framework, but every player also will have a different story describing the path they took and trials they overcame. There's millions of different ways to experience the game, and it's what makes the journey feel so personal. This is the secret ingredient that makes the Pokemon formula work. We already established how easy it is for the player to project themselves onto Red, and all the choices we must make throughout the game allow us to keep feeling immersed and believing the story to be our own. The effective way Red and Blue makes us feel that we're truly going on our own Pokemon adventure is actually the reason why I think Yellow version is less compelling than Red and Blue. It's still, for the most part, the same game, only heavily influenced by the anime. The default player and rival names are now Ash and Gary. We don't get a choice of starter Pokemon anymore. Instead, we're forced to get a Pikachu, one that can't evolve, just like Ash is. We can also obtain all of the 3 old starter Pokemon later in the game, and I mean, come on, who's not going to use all the starters? This is the only Pokemon game where it's naturally possible in the main story. It's a cool novelty to have Bulbasaur, Charmander, and Squirtle all at once, and they form a nice balanced fire-water grass core, so of course we add them all to the team. That's 4 of 6 team slots that are probably going to be filled by static encounters that are the same for every player. In yellow, I don't really get the sense that I am the protagonist. It instead feels like I'm playing as Ash Ketchum. That's still cool in its own way, but I personally don't like it as much. That's mainly because red and blue making me feel like I'm going on my own adventure is the primary reason why I think these games are still enjoyable at all. A side effect of Pokemon's open-ended design to encourage player choice is that the game has to account for so many possibilities and keep itself engaging for different types of players. It'd be a disaster if there were a boss fight that truly required a certain type of Pokemon, for example, because then some amount of control and personalization is taken away from the player. On the other hand, if you don't give the players enough roadblocks, then they might just be able to finish the game by mashing the A button and not engaging with any of the game's mechanics. So wait, hang on. That's exactly what Pokemon Red and Blue does, isn't it? We've already discussed this. Brock with Charmander is the hardest fight in the game by a significant margin, and even then it's not really difficult, it just takes a while because neither Charmander nor Brock's team knows any good attacking moves at this point. Red and Blue are ridiculously easy games. The NPC trainer AI literally cheats in the sense that it reads the player's input before selecting its own action, but it's still somehow terrible. Enemy movesets don't really have intelligent design behind them. I was still getting hit by Leer in the Elite Four, the final challenge of the game. I just mindlessly mashed A with my Poliwrath through Blaine's gym, going out of my way to fight every trainer, never healed once, and still came out with a gym badge and my Poliwrath intact. If you remember these games as being difficult, I'm sorry to say that it might have just been caused by being young and not understanding what was happening. That said, Red and Blue being so easy isn't inherently a bad thing. In fact, it's probably a big reason why the games were so successful in the first place. They were extremely approachable. Anyone could get through the games, and that absolutely helped turn them into the global phenomenon that they were. If all you knew how to do was hit the A button with your starter, then congrats, you can probably still finish the game, or at least make significant progress before asking your playground friends for help. Honestly, it might even be optimal to funnel all of the game's experience and power through it with an overleveled starter. Alright, we got a bit sidetracked there, but what I want to get across is the game's lack of difficulty actually helps create that feeling of being personalized. You can beat the game with any combination of Pokémon, so everyone's journey can be a success. It's incredibly satisfying for the choices we make to have tangible results. We can see our little buddies grow powerful throughout the course of the game, and we were the one who handpicked out which little buddies got to be on our team. It's fun to pick our favorites, train them, see them level up and evolve, and we get to create stories with them as we battle our way through the region. On the subject of traveling through the region and making stories, I want to bring attention to the optional areas of Red and Blue. I really appreciate the inclusion of the Seafoam Islands, Power Plant, and Cerulean Cave. There's no reason to travel to these areas if your only goal is to beat the game, but Pokémon is all about making the adventure our own, right? And sometimes on an adventure, it's fun to go off the beaten path. Red and Blue really nail the optional dungeons, even more so than some of the recent Pokémon games. At the end of each of the dungeons is a powerful legendary Pokémon that the player may attempt to catch. The player is heavily rewarded for going out of their way to explore with a rare, powerful Pokémon, which makes them likely to talk about their exploits to their friends on the playground, encouraging them to go exploring too. Cerulean Cave is probably the best of the optional areas, and that's all because of Mewtwo. Its existence is foreshadowed in Cinnabar Mansion, and you can only enter the cave after becoming the Pokémon League champion. Your reward for beating the game is access to the single most powerful Pokémon there is. I can't possibly think of anything that could create a better feeling than that. Pokémon is all about the feelings it creates for the player. You may have noticed we barely talked about any of the actual game mechanics of Red and Blue. We could have spent time going over the battle system, the Pokémon designs, overworld puzzles, and general progression, but I specifically chose not to do that. Truthfully, it's because it doesn't matter anymore, and frankly, I'm not sure if it ever did. If you look at Red and Blue strictly as technical video games, they fall apart incredibly quickly, even for their time. There's horrible balancing, tons of bugs with many moves just not working, A terrible inventory system, slow overworld traversals, some cryptic progression, and the list goes on and on. If I'm comparing Red and Blue to any other later entry in the franchise that fixes many of these issues, then there's not much reason to play them at all. There are even 2 perfectly fine remakes of the games that are overall much better packages. And yet, despite all of this being true, I still have a good time playing through the original Red and Blue. Sure, I definitely was just kind of turning my brain off at some points and mashing A, but I still got to handpick a team of 6 Pokémon I wanted to use. I still got to choose the path I took to finish the game. I still got to create a new story despite being a series veteran that's played Pokémon games dozens of times before. That's just how incredible the Pokémon formula is. I truly believe it's by far the best franchise at getting the player invested into its world, and is also probably the single most replayable franchise out there. It's a familiar enough setting to be believable, but also magical enough to be interesting. There's constant progression with seeing our Pokémon grow, which ensures we get our regular dopamine rushes when we see numbers go up. We're actively encouraged to make choices that make the games our own from before we even start playing. There's so many branching paths in how we can decide where our story will go, that we can replay the game countless times and still find new ways to experience the adventure. It's absolutely genius, and I don't think Red and Blue get enough props for what they accomplished on their own merit. Okay, so I think we've answered the main questions posed at the beginning of the video by now, but they kind of naturally lead to another interesting question. If Red and Blue can be as flawed as they are while still being fun and starting the biggest media franchise ever, then how could you possibly ever mess up the Pokémon formula? Is it even possible for the franchise to put out a main series game that doesn't resonate with the general audience? I mean, obviously if they turn Pokémon into a first-person shooter or something it will get people upset, but I mean a game in the mainline Pokémon style. Is it possible to make a truly unsuccessful Pokémon game if the core appeal of the franchise originates from how it hooks players into its very concept so easily? Let's take a quick look at Pokémon Scarlet and Violet, which are infamous for having a pretty rough launch. They had tons of performance issues that are frankly unacceptable for a studio of Game Freak's prestige in 2022. Pokémon still hadn't implemented voice acting yet, even though it became industry standard. The game is open world, but the gym levels don't scale, so there's still a correct order to do everything, and you can keep going along those lines of criticism. Scarlet and Violet actually had such a negative launch that Nintendo apologized for the state of the game on release. That's unheard of for Nintendo. Despite all of these issues though, Scarlet and Violet were tremendously successful. They're the second highest selling Pokémon games ever, only behind Red and Blue themselves. Even I like Scarlet and Violet quite a bit, honestly. I think it's easy to dismiss the sales numbers as just being due to, it's Pokémon, it's going to sell 10 million copies no matter what. The franchise is too big to fail. To a certain extent, this is true, but I think it's more indicative of how powerful the Pokémon formula is. The content of the game barely matters as long as players still get to create their own adventures in the world of Pokémon, which Scarlet and Violet are quite good at. This video isn't about Scarlet and Violet though, so enough about them. I brought them up because if Scarlet and Violet didn't fail, then how much can the Pokémon formula withstand? Well, I think I've narrowed down what could actually cause players to lose interest, and I did so by trying to invert all the good things we talked about with Red and Blue earlier. I already mentioned that it would be a disaster if a certain type of Pokémon were required to beat something. That actually reveals 2 potential failure points. First, the Pokémon games really shouldn't be that difficult. As much as I'd love a more challenging Pokémon game personally, I don't think it really suits the franchise. They should be approachable and easy enough to when any team combination can get through the game. The second potential failure area is Pokémon variety. If the pool of Pokémon is too limited to where there's only 1 or 2 answers to a certain fight or something, then that's just pretty unfun. We can go further and say that it wouldn't be that fun to encounter the same Pokémon in every area of the game, right? Part of the Pokémon adventure is discovering new creatures as you progress through the game, so there always needs to be a healthy amount of options available to us. Another aspect that we didn't really touch on before, but I think would be devastating if the franchise actually implemented, would be serious punishments for failure. Imagine if Team Rocket stole some of your Pokémon if you lost to them, for example. Ideally, the player should never be discouraged to experiment with different Pokémon. If they were scared of trying them out due to potentially facing permanent consequences, then the games would probably go stagnant. So, putting it all together, high difficulty, lack of Pokémon variety, and heavy punishment for failure would be the ingredients to make the anti-Pokémon formula. You could continue and say things like ugly Pokémon designs would hurt the franchise too, but I think these gameplay changes alone would cause this hypothetical game to not connect with the general audience. The games wouldn't be able to create many of the feelings we talked about, right? Right? Well, humor me for a second. Can you tell where I'm going with this? If you're in a certain section of the Pokémon fandom already, then you might, but if not, I'll fill you in. These anti-Pokémon formula ingredients are the exact building blocks that form the highly popular fan-made challenge run of Pokémon games, Nuzlocke. If you don't know what a Nuzlocke is, it's essentially a self-imposed set of rules for a Pokémon game playthrough. There are variations in the exact rule set, but generally they all have these two restrictions. You may only capture the first Pokémon you encounter on each route, and if a Pokémon faints in battle, then it's considered dead and may not be used again. The foundation of this very challenge is antithetical to the standard Pokémon formula. Players willingly restrict their options, increase the difficulty, and have a very real failure state with permanent consequences. Somehow, though, I personally find Nuzlocke to be just as, if not more, effective at creating that feeling of investment into a personal journey. Maybe it's just because I'm an adult now, and playing Nuzlocke lets me experience the games I grew up with in a new way that makes them engaging again. I'd imagine the Nuzlocke community skews much older than the wider Pokémon community as well for this reason. I'd recommend trying one to any longtime Pokémon fan though, because despite how different they are to Pokémon's design philosophy, the feeling I get from them is the same. It's just like the different routes to Fuchsia. Cycling Road and routes 13 through 15 couldn't be more different, and yet they end up at the same place anyway. I understand that Nuzlocke don't appeal to everyone, but with how popular they are online at least, I think it's fair to say that they generally resonate with Pokémon fans. With that in mind, if we can flip the Pokémon formula on its head and it still works, then, well, I think that's pretty strong evidence for what we've talked about today, isn't it? The essence of Pokémon is that it's a story that truly feels like our own. The exact methods of creating that feeling can vary wildly to the point of still working in the opposite extreme. In the end, it's all about the personal stories the player makes with the Pokémon games. I have no answer to the question of how you can mess up the Pokémon formula. I'm sure there's a way, but it's proving extremely resilient. While this hypothetical wasn't super relevant to Red and Blue themselves, I think it was worth talking about to demonstrate that Red and Blue really were genius. They may have stumbled in many technical ways, but they hit it out of the park in all the non-obvious categories. The franchise will continue to be successful so long as it keeps taking after the best aspects of the originals that made the series feel so special. We have now finally reached the end. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please do make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe so I can make more videos like these. I think we have the potential to hit 5,000 subscribers by the end of the year, so I would really appreciate any and all support for a smaller channel like mine to continue to grow. Before we truly end, there are a couple of things I wanted to mention that didn't quite fit anywhere in the script. First, I want to say a few things about Red and Blue's story, or rather the lack thereof. I don't blame the games for not really having a fleshed out plot, but something has always bothered me about them. The twist that not only a champion exists beyond the Elite Four, but that it's your rival that you've been fighting for the entire game is brilliant. The other twist that the missing 8th gym leader is actually the boss of the evil Team Rocket is also really cool. Unfortunately, these ideas kind of lost a lot of their potential by being used in the first ever Pokémon games. They'd be so much cooler if characters were more developed and presentation was more fancy and, I don't know, if the plot had any sort of meat on its bones. I just think they're really interesting ideas, and I wish the series had been able to use them in a more developed way. Second, I do want to acknowledge the importance of the famous glitches in Gen 1, like missing No and spawning Mew on Nugget Bridge. They weren't relevant to anything in the video, and it's kind of weird to evaluate clearly unintentional parts of a game, but I do know how they contributed to playground rumors and such back in the day. Or so I hear at least. Remember, I wasn't around back then. I don't really have anything extra to say about them. It's cool how easy it is to do the missing no glitch and have fun with it, at least. It felt wrong to not say anything at all about the glitches, so there you go. They're cool. Finally, I just wanted to say that if you picked up on where most of my team I used for this playthrough and their nickname scheme comes from, then you have my utmost respect. I almost went with the full matching team until I spent around 5 minutes looking for a Pikachu in Viridian Forest, got bored, and just abandoned the idea. Alright, that's it for real. Thank you once again for watching, and see you next time.